Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the 10th season of the New Dance History Lecture Series. I'm Curtis Manning, I'm the producer of the series, and we'd especially like to thank you for coming out in this weather. So I think it's going to be a fantastic lecture tonight. Ron Chapman, who's our most frequent lecturer over the 10 seasons, is going to be talking about a very controversial and fascinating topic. As far as housekeeping, the one quick thing is we're looking forward to the next season, our 11th season of the New Dance History Lecture Series. On the table in the lobby is a sheet where you can recommend topics for next season that we'll go on the decision-making process probably over the summer. But so we'd appreciate your input, maybe some topics that we haven't gotten to yet, or if you look in your program, maybe we would need to revisit some of the topics over 10 seasons. And so if you would just fill out that sheet and leave it for us, we sure would appreciate it. A quick mascot update. As most of you know, my daughter, Chloe Manning, is the mascot. Not chosen because I was her father, but just chosen out of sheer merit and skill. The latest thing is that she's gotten to be even better at soccer, and I'll even call her a little superstar. At least I enjoy watching her. And also, she is going with me to Paris on Friday, so she can get to see the Eiffel Tower. So she's excited about that, and so am I. And so everything's going well with the series and the school and the mascot. So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Ron Chapman.
Greetings all. Can you hear me okay? Good. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I could say that the weather tonight is reminiscent of the weather as it was in that of this tremendous battle, but I'd be lying. You might feel better about it though, having said that. But anyway, we're going to talk about the fall of New Orleans. This is better. The fall of New Orleans in the Civil War. Okay? So see if technology favors us. Nick, I'm not sure. Now, one at a time. Louisiana wasn't typical when it came down to the Confederacy. It's one thing you want to get straight. In most places, they immediately embraced the concept of the Confederacy and separation. But Louisiana was totally different because the city of New Orleans was dependent upon trade through the Mississippi River, which drained everything from the watersheds of the Missouri and the Ohio and the Mississippi itself. A lot of northern states, a lot of transit coming in. You had investors from northern states in the city of New Orleans. So there was a tendency to want to kind of stay out of this if it could all possibly do so. So there was resistance to it. It caused difficulties for secession movement on the one hand. See, we have interesting deals here. I'm dying here. The people who were opposed to immediate secession were called cooperationists, and that's what they rose to fight against it. Their attitude towards it was, let's wait till something happens. Let's not immediately jump into this thing because you don't understand what the implications of war might be. This thing is really... Okay. Eventually, this is going to be tough. Eventually they failed, and Louisiana did indeed join the Confederacy. Next slide. Preparations, go ahead, please. Louisiana began preparations first at Camp Walker, which was the Metairie Racetrack. We all know that, because Metairie Racetrack is now the Metairie Cemetery. If you ever pass by it, you notice it's in an oval because it is a cemetery, and it was a track. They put all the troops there initially, and that was one of the places where the men were trained and prepared to go into battle. Next. Camp Moore was later established because the amount of men had set up in Tangipahoa Parish, which was a paradise in comparison simply because the mosquitoes weren't quite as bad. And generally in these types of situations, more men die from diseases than die in combat anyway. Chalmette had a battery of 10 cannons to 32 pounds and 32-pound balls, and it was about where Kaiser is right now. You know, the old, I say Kaiser, but Kaiser used to be. Yeah. Now it's the St. Bernard Port Authority. Woe to the 8th and the 10th Brigade to Crescent City. People in Louisiana were living in the illusion of the War of 1812. You know, they had defeated the massive British Army, and they were convinced totally that the same thing would happen again if anyone tried to enter the environs of the city of New Orleans and tried to take it. All men between the ages of 18 and 45 were made eligible for enlistment. but by 1862, 7 parishes refused to send any troops in. In fact, they referred to themselves as going to see General Greene, which meant basically running into the woods and hiding until the enlistment soldiers had left the area. Again, especially this was in North Louisiana, because in many ways there they felt it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, because a lot of people feel that so many slaves were exempt from military service, and since the war was basically over the issue of slavery and tariffs, those are the issues that didn't really affect these people, so why not being drawn into it? Most troops, and not only troops, but munitions and everything else were immediately sent from New Orleans towards Virginia. Because you remember the opening battles take place in Virginia. So as a result of the conflict happening, no one expected this thing to go on for 5 years or 4 years. They expected it to be over with rather quickly, a skirmish, and that would be it. So after Bull Run, the question was to bring as much force, as much ammunition, as many people as you possibly had into that center locale where everything would take place, because they felt it would be dispensed with, and either they would take Richmond or would take Washington, D.C., and it'd all be over with. Also, free blacks. And Mary Gaiman has a great book on free people of color in Louisiana, in New Orleans. I suggest everyone read it. It's a tremendous work. And you had a very large population of free people of color here, some of whom owned slaves. They were heavily involved in the economy, and they were felt threatened as well. Now, it's a twofold thing. On the one hand, their economy was felt threatened the same way the rest of the economy was with the Confederates down here. But the other, there were social pressures on them to try to show loyalty to the South, regardless of how they felt about the institution of slavery. So theirs was a difficult choice in many cases. They formed the Native Guards. It's kind of sad. In Jackson Barracks, right before the storm, I was going through the records, and they had all sorts of records on the Native Guards. And I don't know where those are anymore. They had like little cards of every member, and there were thousands of them, you know? So it's just a shame that that either was lost completely or it's frozen somewhere in some vault somewhere. We have no idea what happened to those records. This is the theater of operations in Louisiana. First you'll have New Orleans, which is obviously the center of attraction. Second place you'll see is up there at Vicksburg. And this is the basic point and problem for the Confederacy. The Confederacy as an administration never thought or never believed it was possible to take New Orleans coming upriver. They were totally convinced that they had to pass the Union, had to pass Vicksburg. And if you're familiar with Vicksburg, especially at that time, the Mississippi River passed right by. It was high up on a bluff, heavily armed, where you could shoot down into the river, but vessels in the river weren't capable of shooting up high enough with elevation of guns to reach the offending weapons. So it was a significant barrier. That's like, after New Orleans falls, you know, Farragut will go up, take Baton Rouge, he'll then go up, try to take Vicksburg. That won't work. He'll retreat back to Baton Rouge and then to New Orleans, and Port Hudson's opened up. And what happens is the area below Port Hudson's under Union control, the area above Vicksburg's under Union control, and that corridor between is a corridor whereby information and ammunition and food and everything can run from Louisiana and Texas and Arkansas into the rest of the Confederacy. Shutting off the Mississippi River was absolutely critical to the Union because it divided the Confederacy. Plan to defend the city. It begins with Pierre G.T. Beauregard. He's colonel of the engineers. He's responsible for building the custom house, and we have the plans, if I'm not mistaken here. A friend of ours gave them to us, amazing plans for the custom house. He also was involved in draining the city at that time and building a drainage system. So he was truly a military engineer, kind of reminiscent of what would be the Corps of Engineers. Next. He decided to draw up his own plan for the defense of New Orleans. Looked to our most vulnerable point, the Mississippi. He knew where the danger lay. He recognized that he would have to report to protect the city from at least a half an hour's attack. That's all it would take to pass the forts. He recognized that the forts that were there had to be well armed, fully equipped with long-range guns. All the trees had to be cut from their back to give you a clear line of fire, so they couldn't hide behind the trees that were there. Large floating barrier would have to be erected. His idea was chain and ships, well lit, so you could see if anybody comes on it. Beyond that, you'd have fire rafts along the board, which are basically rafts filled with pine knots. I don't know if any of you all ever lit a pine knot on fire, but it's an interesting experience. You can imagine a whole raft half full. And the point being that if the ships start coming down the river, they're repelled by the barrier. You can take them apart by the fort, if by the forts on either side. And if they get through the barrier, then you cut loose the fire rafts, you set them on fire, and you float them down the river with the flotilla coming up, bumping up against it, will set them on fire. In fact, Farragut almost lost to Hartford because of one of those fire rafts. And then below that, they had some gunboats that were in the process of being completed, but because Louisiana and the Confederacy, actually in general, lacked an industrial complex, they didn't have the ability to produce, believe it or not, the drive shaft is what was missing more than anything else. So building advanced weapons, even though the Confederacy had the idea to do it and the desire to do it and the need to do it, they didn't have the technology to achieve it in a timely manner, and that'll be a problem as well. Next. Of course, PGG Beauregard having worked out the total plan of defense for the city, it's not the least bit surprising that they replaced him and took in his place Paul Octave Hébert, who virtually did nothing for an entire year, believing what the Confederacy believed, that they had to come down from Vicksburg, so why spend so much energy on protecting the city of New Orleans from coming up the river. Next. As a consequence, Beauregard moves on, and he's responsible. It's an interesting story if you ever Google it and read the story of Fort Sumter, but he's responsible for the opening fires of the battle at Fort Sumter, which opens the Civil War on April 12th, so we're 10 days away, 1861. Notice the date, it's April 1861. Louisiana is out the war by April 1862. We're not in it very long. Next. The Union, first thing they did was blockade the city. This was a major port city. It was not only a point of focus for the Confederacy, it was the economic giant of the Confederacy. And by shutting off the port's trade, they could strangle the port and hopefully economically strangle the Confederacy. There weren't a lot of cities, in the South. Before the war commenced, trade here was $550 million. After the blockade was set up, it was $51 million. That would give you an idea of how devastating the blockade was. Trade was virtually shut off. The city was threatened, but the Confederate government persisted in refusing to believe it would happen the way people said it might. They insisted on believing it had to come from up north. And indeed the Union was. They were attacking Island number 10, which was an island above Vicksburg. They were amassing tremendous troops. They made several attempts and will continue to make attempts to take Vicksburg. It's not till Grant gets involved that they achieve it. But the pressure is on Vicksburg, and I think that's what probably focused their attention there. Next. The defenses included Fort St. Philip and Fort Jackson, as I said, fire barges, and the gunboat Louisiana, which was not completed, but it had its guns. But again, it was awaiting a drive shaft. But part of the problem was unity of command. The gunboats were controlled by private investors. So the Confederate authorities didn't have unified command. This was in private hands, so it's difficult to get these people to do what you wanted them to do. You had to basically request them to do it, which sometimes they weren't willing to do. They also, as I said, had the chain. They finally put the chain up, but it wasn't no measure equal to what Beauregard had intended to do. Okay. They thought it was enough, what they had. Most weren't quite sure about that, they were saying. And New Orleans, as mentioned earlier, was the key to the entire South. So everyone was basically watching what was going to happen here. Now taking New Orleans, as I said earlier, and taking Vicksburg, and that was the focus. That's why when New Orleans is taken, Farragut goes right up immediately to Vicksburg, hoping he can take it by surprise from underneath in the hopes that he can strangle the South and cut the South in half. Okay. News spread, recruits arrived, citizens reveled in the success. People were parading around. They were all thrilled with the idea of the Confederacy initially. June 1st, 1861, Louisiana had about 16,000 men in arms ready to fight. September 28th, Governor Moore was made commander-in-chief, and the parishes throughout Louisiana started allocating as much forces, as much money and resources as they possibly could to the Confederate cause. And then while that's going on, suddenly in December 1861, federal forces take Ship Island. Ship Island is where Pakenham organized his assault on the Battle of New Orleans. Ship Island is where Bienville first landed to do his explorations. Ship Island is a recurring theme in Louisiana history. Okay? People in New Orleans, again, cried out, Chalmers' glories will be repeated. They were totally convinced that nothing could happen from them. They were safe from that direction. The reason being, more than anything else, was likely English Turn. If you look geographically at English Turn, it's just this incredible bend in the river. Well, if you're under sail power, you cannot make, I think it's something like 280 degrees. You can't do 280 degree turn on the sail power without stopping, dropping anchor, and waiting for a shift in the wind. They didn't account for with steam. That was 1815. This is 1862. Significant difference takes place. Okay? Shortages plague New Orleans. Inflation sets in. Scarcity starts setting in. The city of New Orleans is starting to really feel the Civil War. Infrastructure, railroads were virtually non-existent. You had a few about, but you didn't have standardized gauge, so the different short line rails were running on different gauge. You didn't really have a woolens industry per se. You had a lot of cotton being produced, but you didn't have an industry making it into anything. Kind of like we do with oil. We produce the oil, we produce the chemicals, but we don't make the finished products. The same thing here. So women were hand sewing uniforms and things of that sort. Everyone was involved in the effort to try to do what they possibly could. Now New Orleans starts feeling the pressure. It's threatened. Okay? This is a view actually from the clay statue at the foot of Canal Street out towards the lake. Not too many people are familiar with the clay statue anymore. This is Confederate General Lovell. He's in command of, hope we don't lose the light. He's in command of the forces in New Orleans, and he is persistently, throughout his time that he's here, trying to tell the Confederate administrators in Richmond that the city of New Orleans is incredibly vulnerable, even to the point where he'll read about a detailed plan for the invasion of New Orleans in the Washington Star newspaper. And he'll be totally shocked that the Union is just openly advertising what they're going to do. And despite that, the Confederacy is adamant in a position that it's not going to happen. Frustration is building in Lovell. Right? The economic crisis becomes more acute. Martial law is established on March 15th, the Ides of March, 1862. They have to establish free markets because food has become a shortage. They have to feed families. So the first day it opens, you have 723 families in here. March 7th, 1862, and March 25th, 1921 families are seeking food assistance. That's how tight things have got. General Lovell, commander of the New Orleans forces, starts getting worried. He keeps starting to tell the Confederate troops, you've taken too much away from me. You've taken ammunition, you've taken guns, you've taken troops. You keep taking. You can't forget us. You know, we are vulnerable here, but no one will listen to it. Washington indicated now that a major fleet was actually headed for the Gulf region. At first it was accounts in the newspaper, and now they're getting hard intelligence that there's a fleet headed for the area. The forts can be passed. We are disorganized. We have no general officer to command and direct. That's what Lovell is saying to the Confederate forces. He does not have control over the forts. He does not have control over the Manassas. He does not have control over the Louisiana. He does not have control over the fire rafts. He does not have control over the river fleet. He just has control over the army. And he's frustrated because he sees the problem, but trying to coordinate the disparate elements is just not working very well for him. Judah P. Benjamin was from Louisiana. The Confederate Attorney General states the fleet is not headed for New Orleans, and fears about people are without cause. What do you do? How do you get the point across? How do you impress upon these people the need and the reality of what's about to happen? Fear is always the same. It's going to come from Vicksburg, and Vicksburg is not vulnerable. Vicksburg is successfully blocking the river. You have nothing to worry about. That's the refrain, the persistent refrain coming out of Richmond. It starts here. This is the theater of attack. This here is, you got here about the mouth of the river, the passes. Here you have the two forts, St. Philip and Jackson. Up at the top here you have English Turn, which in the old days, this bend in the river right here would effectively make it impossible for sailing ship. With steam power is no problem whatsoever. And here's the city of New Orleans, right there. So that's the theater. This is what the operation is all about. This is just a close-up showing an idea of what they wanted to do. These are the two forts on either side here, and here's the chain across the bottom. Next. It begins with an operation at the head of passes. What they've been doing is blockading the mouth of the river. But you have three passes running out the mouth of the river, and you always have blockade runners. Everybody remembers Brett Butler, right, from Gone with the Wind, the famous blockade runner. So the way to stop that was to decide to go up the river and get to what's called the head of the passes, where the three passes meet, and occupy that. Once you've done that, you've got a complete stranglehold on access or egress from the city of New Orleans. Right. What happens there is that Pope, who was the commander of the Union vessels, goes up the mouth of the river with the Water Witch and with several other vessels and decides to occupy it. That night, the Manassas comes down the river, which is an ironclad. This is kind of a sketch of what you look like, okay? If you go to the next slide, you can see she's 85 feet long. She's 14 feet below the waterline, only 5 feet above the waterline, and got 20 feet of solid steel in the bow. She's a ram. And the object is, like the old Nautilus, if you read Jules Verne, is to just take one of these wooden ships, plow into it, blow a tremendous hole in it, throw it in reverse, back out, and pick your next target. There's not a whole lot they can do because the cannonballs are just going to bounce off the top. It's rounded, it's stealthy, actually, for its time, and it's steam driven. The problem is the first vessel that hits it succeeds in putting a significant hole in, but goes back to engineering. The impact dislodges and dismounts the engine. So as a result, it only has this one strike, and then it limps back upriver. Of course, Pope is so shattered and shaken by what's happened, he immediately withdraws all of the Union ships from the head of the passes, and that's why it's referred to as Pope's Run, because it's a panic. Of course, this just set off celebrations in the city of New Orleans and reinforced the idea that, woe to the enemy who tries to come up the river, bringing back shades of what happened in the Battle of New Orleans. Next. What happens now is the Union effectively starts working on the offensive. They're now planning how they're going to take the city of New Orleans. Okay. The Union plan. David Porter comes up with the idea, and it's kind of amazing if you start reading about this, the access to the president. Can you imagine just being able to walk up to the president of the United States and give him your idea? Today, as a military man, friend of mine, Guy, you're in the military. Can you imagine that? And that's what basically happens. He comes up with this idea, he talks to his commanding officer, they arrange a meeting, he sits down with Lincoln, he explains his idea. This is what he wants to do. Okay? First, wooden ships can pass the forts. It can be done. They're steam driven, they can plow right past them, it's not a problem whatsoever. However, the forts have to be softened first. And I got an idea on how to do that. Okay? What we'll do is, we'll have 48-hour mortar attack. For 48 hours, we'll be raining shells. I don't know if you're familiar with mortars, but a cannon shoots kind of vertical. A mortar just lobs shells in over the top. Well, when you're working with a fortified position like a fort, a mortar is what you need. So his idea is to arrange mortars and have mortars for 48 hours raining ammunition into these forts. Well, the question comes, well, that's a great idea, but how are you going to do it? He says, well, I got an idea there too. Next. His idea is to take schooners and build schooners and mount a mortar in each schooner. Well, people look at him and say, have you any idea of the recoil of this thing? They're going to blow right through the bottom of the ship. No, we can do it. It's doable. We got it all worked out. It can be done. Next. Following that, what we'll do is, after I've softened up the forts, then you can have a moderate vessels, steam vessels, then go past them. Because they'll be so distracted with the rain of mortars, because the mortars are coming in while the attack's taking place and before it. Then the invasion can take place at night. We can work our way through. It's really not as difficult as you really might think. Next. Following that, you're going to need an army, because obviously you need boots on the ground if you can take anything. So what we'll do is a relatively small army. We can find somebody. The guy they find is the Beast Butler. As it was put, he was involved. He was kind of a questionable character at best. And as the Unions put it, we can bury this elephant, this Republican elephant somewhere, and it was Louisiana where they buried him. So the idea was with troops, after you've taken the forts and you've moved up the river, you then have land forces that come behind you and you wait, and they can effectively take the city itself. So it's kind of a coordinated land-sea operation. Next. Porter meets with Lincoln. He lays the whole plan out. Lincoln agrees. Then he turns to Porter and he says, well, all right, you've got this plan all worked out. Have you any suggestion as to who might be able to command you? He says, yeah, my brother-in-law, guy by the name of Farragut. Everybody remembers him, right? Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. You know, that's his mobile. So he says, okay, let's go with it. Okay? So he's charged to lead the Armada. Okay? This is Admiral Farragut, and that's David Porter. Okay? This is General Bernard. Interesting character, because while they're discussing this whole thing, there's this thing called serendipity. So while they're discussing the ins and outs and about the forts and all this kind of stuff, General John Bernard hears about it, and he says, guys, I got something to tell you here. Basically, he's the chief engineer of the Potomac, and prior to being a chief engineer of Potomac, prior to being in the North, he was in the South. He was actually in the environs of New Orleans. He rebuilt the forts St. Philip and Jackson in the 1840s. He had all the plans. He had everything. He knew exactly how well they were defended. He knew how thick the walls were. He knew everything about the forts. And they're like, really? Yeah, man, I got it all. Right? So what he does is he sits down and provides Farragut with everything he needs. He's got the lay of the land. He's got everything mapped out. From a military perspective, that kind of intelligence is invaluable, especially having it drafted by an engineer, not a spy sketching something down, but an engineer who's actually done it. He sits down and he says, look, I've worked it out. This is the math. You got 3.5 miles to travel. That's assuming it's fully armed and they have the long guns that should be in that fort. You really can't make that assumption because we don't know what the Confederacy has when it comes to weapons. Anyway, 2 miles, you're going to be under 100 to 125 guns, assuming they're fully equipped. For 1.5 miles, you'll be under 50 to 100 guns. These are going to be blasting and blazing the whole time, okay? But you got to do it at night, and next, it's going to take you 25 to 30 minutes of calculating the stretch of the river and the speed of your boats. You're going to catch hell for 35 minutes. But after that, you basically have clear sailing. Okay? This is a sketch of Fort St. Philip. I really can't say if that's his, probably not, but that's one of the early descriptions. This is from 1817, so it's obviously way before his time, but it's close to what he was looking at the time. Okay? Confederate response. All this is taking place. Lovell still cannot convince people that New Orleans is threatened. This is starting to really get to him. Okay? He could not get unified control, and he gets so upset that he actually dashes off a letter that says, I found matters generally so deficient and incomplete that I was unwilling to commit that condition to writing for fear of their falling into the wrong hands. How bad is that? When you won't even tell your commanding officer how bad the situation is because you're afraid that the enemy might get hold of the information and realize just exactly how bad your situation is. Yeah. You know, this is a pretty critical state of affairs. The cannons were lacking shells, they lacked carriages, they lacked ammunition. The forts actually were in disrepair. The ships they were looking at was not finished being constructed. The Manassas was now damaged. All ammunition was at a minimum, and the river defense fleet was uncontrollable. In fact, right before, several days before the attack, the river defense fleet leaves and goes up to island number 10, north of Vicksburg. And Lovell's like, are you serious? Yeah. The only thing I got, most of it is gone. You know, so it's almost unbelievable when you look at how this thing unfolds. Weapons had been removed from Lovell's command and constantly taken away from him and sent to the front elsewhere. Again, the refrain, Louisiana is under no threat of an attack. The attack begins. Admiral Farragut organized the assault to New Orleans from Ship Island. He had, just as Pakenham had done before, so he had gotten there on September 17th, 1862. Now he's working towards completing his plan. He used warships, gunboats, motorboats, and he assisted with land forces by General Louis Butler. Okay? The Confederates believed that they could fall from this direction because of Vicksburg. Back to the same story. I mean, I hate to be redundant, but that's exactly how Richmond was. What he does is finally he gets everything in preparation. And in April 1862, he pulls anchor from Ship Island, and crosses the Mississippi Bar. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the bar, but you got the sandbars at the mouth of the river. He's got to pull himself through those, and that's what he uses. The advantage he has is steam. It takes him 2 weeks. He takes his water barges first and his gunboats first across because they're the shallowest. He then hooks up ropes and starts pulling his vessels through the sand, if you can imagine that. And each one, he drags them through the sand, drags it through the sand, drags it through the sand, until finally he's got his entire fleet now at the head of passage, okay? Then the attack is on. Porter then starts firing his boosted position. This is one of the mortar boats right here. The pictures really don't come out that good. I have a better shot, the next one, I believe. There. This will show you the size of the mortar on that thing. I think it's a 16-inch mortar you got there. Okay? And you can see the size. So here you have the position here of the mortar fleet. What he does is, if you look at the, this is downriver in this direction here. If you look at the two forts, he's in the bend. So he can lob the shells over and they cannot hit him. You can see the ranging marks where the forts are. They really can't get to where his mortar fleet is. Down here is a position of where Lovell wanted the Louisiana. He wanted it below the barrier, but they refused to do it, the people who controlled Louisiana. Later, after it was all over with, Farragut and Porter both agreed that had the Louisiana been stationed down there, the attack would have probably been blunted because Louisiana was well armed and was, you couldn't hurt it. Cannonballs just bounced off of it. It was solid steel. But they never put it in there. Instead, they had it positioned above there. You can kind of see it, the second position and the final position. So they kept it basically out of place. So it wasn't effectively in the battle at all. Here's your barrier, chain barrier across the top. You see your fire rafts up at the front up there. So he's now raining shells, mortars onto both of these forts. Next. This is just one of the sketches that were done pretty close after the time, showing the mortar attacks. You see the mortar shells coming down and hitting the forts. This shows the damage. You can see the damage done to the forts. Each one of those spots is a mortar impact. The problem was, though, fusing. With a mortar, you got to set the fuse because you want it to blow up right when it gets close. Well, if you don't have it set right and it blows up too high, it just rains shrapnel down on the people. If it doesn't go off on time, it goes off a little delayed. We know what the mud's like in Louisiana, right? The sinking into the mud, and, and not really doing any damage. So all these mortar shells are flying into the two forts, and Porter's all through with his operation, and Farragut's looking at it, and he's wondering, I don't know if this is really working or not. This is an impatient man, right? He's just kind of tapping his foot. He wants to get into this thing, and he's just looking at it, okay? Next. This is a Union ship, probably a Hartford. It's probably Farragut's boat. If you see, it's a combination of steam and sail. You got the rigging and you got the stack. That's in the transitional phase. Right? The Queen falls. April 18th, Porter's gunboats start bombarding. They shoot about 1,400 rounds a day. This was going on for 2 days, and finally Farragut's just getting impatient. So he looks at Porter and he says, I don't know, man. I don't think you're really accomplishing what you're after. You're making a lot of noise. It's a great fireworks show. I don't know how effective this is. So he turns around to a midship. Never nice to be a midshipman, right? Tells the boys, son, he says, get up in that mizzen mast, climb up in the rigging. This is what I want you to do. He says, anytime they fire a shell and it goes into the fort, I want you to do this. If it lands outside the fort, I want you to do this. And I'm going to sit here and count the ins and the outs. And we'll see what's going on here. So little kids up there, in, out, in, out. Farragut's looking at it and says, all right, let's see now, get down. He says, look, guys, I appreciate what you're trying to do. You may have had some effect, but the bottom line is, I'm moving forward. This is typical Farragut, Basically cast Porter aside and decides to organize his move. Next. Farragut decided to run the blockade at 3:30 a.m. He charged the chain barrier with the ships. What he does is smart. He decides there'll be no lights on. What he's going to do is, he's got a moon out there. It's not a bright moon, there's some moon, there's some starlight out there. So he takes his decks and he whitewashes his decks. Now, if you see the size of the ship, the gunnels go up the side, the deck's recessed on the inside, so by whitewashing the inside of the decks, it reflects the outside ambient light from outside, but doesn't reflect beyond the ship. So as a result, his guys can man their guns and see what they're doing. Second thing is, he has the guys go get mud and rub mud all down the sides of the ships, because Navy ships are basically painted black lacquer. They reflect light. He's trying to kill that, so he covers it with that. He then looks at his engines and says, all right, I want all the chain from the anchors woven back and forth on either side of the ship where the engine is to act as chain mail. Lash it together so if a cannon hits it, it'll hit the chain and it won't go through the boat. Next, I want sandbags on the inside packed up, so if it happens to get through, it goes into a sandbag and doesn't hit my engine. Because the last thing I need to do is lose an engine while I'm in the middle of this thing. Because that's not going to be a happy place to be, because we're going to be caught in a serious crossfire here. Then he looks up at the rigging, and he starts thinking about it, and he says, man, this rigging is betrayal. So he turns around and tells his crew, go out there by the batch and cut down a bunch of willow trees. And he has them cut down the willow trees and bring it up and tie it into the rigging. This is almost like Macbeth, you know, because he's got it all tied up in the rigging. So when the Confederates think they see something, they just see trees. But they start moving, you know, the woods. So here we are. The chain broke. What happens here is we have what's called a freshet. It was a very strong current. We had that just last year, right? Remember back then you had a lot of debris in the river. Well, it's building up on the chain, and the chain wasn't built to the directions that Beauregard had requested. It was a lot weaker. The chain breaks under the pressure, and all of the debris, trees and everything else goes downstream. Well, the Confederates are able to repair it, but not that effectively, okay? So what happens is he has a bunch of guys in a gunboat to go forward. They jump out. They're trying to dismantle the chain, and it's a series of anchored boats. They get a portion of it through. They pull their gunboat up, and they're going forward. When they run across some Confederate gunboats, and they get into a battle. Well, when in the midst of the battle, they lose power, and they're drifting down. The captain of the small gunboats panicked because he's drifting down, but he doesn't realize it's the best thing that happened, because as he drifts down and he hits the barrier, he knocks the barrier loose and opens up a big gap in it, which opens the door for Farragut. So it's one of those serendipitous moments, okay? The Chapman barrier, so within 45 minutes, it's a bloody fight. It's a brutal battle on both sides, because the Confederates, when you read about it, they just hear things don't look right, and they start seeing a little bit movement, and then one of the water battery, which is the battery closest to the river, sees something moving. He opens fire, and at that moment, everybody starts opening fire, and that's when you have this tremendous explosions taking place. People in the city must have been awakened by all this and know that something is definitely going on right now, okay? They make it through, and in the 35 minutes, they're past. Virtually harmless. They've lost, I think, one ship. That's about it. And it wasn't serious a loss. It just couldn't continue forward, so it drifted back downstream. Next, they had to contend with the Chapman battery. The Chapman battery only had 10 guns, and they were facing Navy ships with broadsides. They fought as bravely as they possibly could, but they simply ran out of ammunition. It's another Bunker Hill. You know, what are you going to do when you run out of ammunition? You just spike your guns and you leave. So after they leave, it opens the door, and the gunboats, the regular gunboats in the river had fled. The fireboats were never set on fire. A few of them were, because one of them reached up against Hartford. The rest were still tied to the bank. Just the total confusion had proven itself true. Now that the whole thing was collapsed. This is the order of battle of the Union vessels, and the names of the captains, who's commanding, and the name of the ship. The Iroquois was here, the Kennebecs from Maine, and these are the different orders. Okay, next. This is the order of line going past the barrier, past the two forts as they get up, okay? Next. This is a sketch of the battle. You see the two forts, you see the Farragut's troops coming around the outside, this is his fleet coming around the outside, and the exchange of gunfire taking place. This is a color painting. There was a series of paintings that are really beautiful, some of them. They really capture the spirit of what's going on here. And as they work their way around the bend, you can see the forts in the distance firing, okay? Farragut arrives. 25th, Farragut finds himself overlooking the Vieux-Carré. You know what to do? I mean, Butler is way away. He's captured the city with a fleet. He's got the gun ports open. People in the city of New Orleans are rushing out. They're singing the Bonnie Blue Flag and all this kind of stuff. They're dancing, they're screaming. People are sending cotton bales down, setting them on fire, setting walls on fire, throwing all kind of stuff in the river. Confusion and panic is broken out in the city. And Farragut's sitting there wondering, well, I guess I got to take the city. You know, there's just no question about it. I've got it physically, but I mean, you got to get on land, right? So next slide. This is a drawing, actually, of Farragut's fleet arriving in the city. You can see the fleet down here. Next. Lovell defends his actions. What Farragut does, and this is absolutely amazing, is that to Perkins, George Perkins, he turns to a lieutenant. Now imagine the city of New Orleans is just in pandemonium. And he turns to a lieutenant and he says, take another officer with you, take a boat, paddle up to the dock, get out, and walk to the mayor's office and demand the city surrender. The guy does it. Okay? Can you imagine that? People are just screaming and yelling at him. And all the people who write about it is George Washington Cable, because he's there as a young man at the scene. And of course, he's on the rebel side. But after he reflects, he has never seen such bravery in his life. He says that these men didn't crack a smile, didn't show any anger, didn't show any emotion. People were spitting on them and yelling and wanting to hang them and all this, waving swords in their faces and pistols and everything, and they just walked with their American flag and walked right to the mayor's office and asked him to surrender. He panicked. He refused to do it. He said, I'm not in control anyway. Lovell's got to do it. Lovell comes in and says, you might as well do it because I'm out of here, because I'm taking my troops out of here, because I'm not going to turn the city into a bloodbath, so I'm packing in. I just want to let you know, my troops are already on trains for Jackson. I'm catching the last train out of here. In which case, then, the city had to be surrendered. These guys gave him about 24 hours to make a decision. Actually, I think it was 8 hours to make a decision. They go back then, but then they're worried about him going back. So the mayor sneaks him out the back door in a closed carriage, brings him back to the wharf where they work their way back to the ship. Farragut hears about it, thinks about it, says, no, I want an immediate surrender. I want flags hoisted. I want flags hoisted at the custom house. I want flags hoisted at the mint. And I want the Confederate flag taken off of the State House, the City Hall, and I want the Union flag placed there as well. He now sends a detachment of 250 men with cannons, Marines, to go in to accomplish this. You know, we had Gallia Hall, right, on St. Charles Avenue, so they got the cannons pointing in either direction, a detachment of Marines around, they go inside, and that's when they noticed that there's already been a flag hoisted on the mint. Who put it up? Perkins has no idea. Okay. He then orders that the flag be cut down. Mayor refuses to do it. Nobody else will do it. One of the Union soldiers says, I'll do it. He gets the keys, goes up, unlocks it, goes on the roof, takes down the flag, and hoists the Union Jack. At which point, when they're going back to the ship, they notice someone, like the someone is named Mumford, cut down the American flag over the men. Okay, next. Lovell defended his actions, because there would be a court, he will request a court-martial, and he won't get it for years. He wants to clear his name. He wants everybody to know how hard he tried to make this thing a defended position and how much difficulty he had convincing the Confederacy that they refused to see the dangers. Obviously, they didn't want to have a court-martial because they probably didn't want their incompetence to come to light. It's better to just blame Lovell. He'll finally be vindicated, but as he said, resistance would have been a wanton and criminal waste of blood of women and children without the remotest possibility of any good result. There's no way. Now, we had the chance. We told you what to do. You didn't do it. As I said, Perkins visited the mail. The city itself fell really without firing a shot. Next. William Mumford. He's the man who cut down the Union flag on April 27th, 2 days before the city would officially surrender, and the flag was put up. When General Butler comes in town, he hears about this, and the first thing he says is, who's this guy Mumford? I want him. At which point, he captures Mumford and immediately has him hung for treason. That was to send a real clear message to the people in New Orleans where they stood. This is the beginning of the Beast Butler's reputation. Okay? Right. Butler was declared a murderer throughout the Confederates for having done this. He'll have other problems with the Women's Act and Spoon's Butler. I mean, Mr. Butler's got a variety of issues, especially breaking embassies and taking Confederate money. That's going to be his eventual undoing when he comes down to it. But his action on his part, as brutal as it was, quieted down the city because they realize now that they were totally under Union control. Then Butler comes in and completely occupies the city. Next. This is a sketch of the time of the Memphis packet landing. This is the boat arriving with Perkins in it, and all the people yelling and screaming and waving flags around him. Okay, this is a picture of Mumford cutting down the flag. This is a sketch of the time they'd use it in the different newspapers now. This is the Union defenses that will set up. You see some defensive perimeters that are put up. You see these red markings along there, because once they had the city, the object was to make sure they kept it. So this is from the Confederacy. The impact, it was devastating. You know, first of all, the Confederacy was struggling desperately to get England and France involved. Their hope was for a negotiated settlement. Don't we do that all the time when people are fighting? We go in there with our troops and say, all right, you guys settle it out. Serbia, for instance, you know, Kosovo, these sorts of things. The South was hoping that France and England, who were dependent upon southern cotton and saw the carnage that would take place, would step in and try to separate the two parties. All they wanted was separation. That was a victory for the South. Elements in England were thinking about that. Elements in France were thinking about that. When news of the fall of New Orleans came, it was throwing cool water on the whole idea. That, coupled with the Emancipation Proclamation, the Battle of Antietam, sealed the deal. But this was the first thing that, when the movement was afoot, it threw it back. Right? The city was a social and financial center of Louisiana and the Confederacy. By taking it out, they had succeeded in accomplishing what they wanted to do. They gutted the economy of the Confederacy. Next. 1/4 of the state's population lived in the city. So by taking the city out, they effectively took Louisiana out. Now, Louisiana will still be in to the very end. It'll be a divided state. You'll have the Battle of Mansfield up around Shreveport. Kirby Smith will be up there. He'll be up there to the end of the war and try to actually continue for a while until his troops abandon him, you know, after Appomattox. But still, you know, the city, the southern part of the state is firmly now in Union hands. Next. Federal occupation becomes a source of revenue. People like Butler made a fortune. His brother made a real fortune because now they started getting the cotton plantations going again. And the sad thing for the slaves was that the slaves thought they were free, because before the war they were subjected to being under the whip of an overseer and forced to pick cotton. After this takes place and the Union takes control, then slaves start running to the city of New Orleans. They don't exactly know what to do with them. So one thing they do is clean the city up, which is the first time the city had ever been cleaned, and the result of that was for 10 years there were very few infectious diseases that were taking place. I think you can understand that, right? You know, that that city had never been cleaned. And on top of that, the slaves, though, a lot of them were forced to work on the plantations, now under the control of Union soldiers, because they wanted the cotton. They needed the cotton for uniforms, and Butler and his brother needed the cotton for profits. So the idea was to get the economy going again. Okay? The loss of New Orleans was a staggering blow to the pride of Louisiana and to the Confederacy. I mean, losing a city this big, your capital economic city, that quickly in the war was a devastating blow. Militarily, place the federal troops' possession of Dagger at the heart of the Confederacy. They retreat up the Confederates, they reinforce Port Hudson, they got the corridor I first explained to you. Vicksburg will fall, I think the day after Gettysburg. When Vicksburg falls, Port Hudson falls immediately. And once those two are gone, the Mississippi River now belongs to the Union. The Confederacy is successfully divided. Okay? As for New Orleans, the harbor is now open for trade. It starts flourishing again. And in fact, this is a whole nother story. The city of New Orleans becomes the first experiment in presidential reconstruction. You know, President Lincoln puts a lot of effort into the city. You start having integrated railroads, integrated schools. He's really making a movement to show what reconstruction can be like in the city of New Orleans. And believe it or not, the very last thing he did was deliver a speech, I believe it was, on reconstruction in New Orleans, then went to a play. And that was the end. So it shows you how much New Orleans was on his mind as a model for what he wanted to achieve. Next. Anybody familiar with the oldest piece of what I call graffiti in the city of New Orleans? Chapman takes control of the city. Next. One of his first actions was to inform the citizens of the city of New Orleans that for you, the war is over with. And what he does is he practices a little bit of history. There was an incident one time with Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun where they had a dinner and they toasted states' rights versus federal power. At which point, after Calhoun made his speech, Andrew Jackson stood up and said, the Union must and shall be preserved, a word to that effect. What Butler does is find a stonemason, goes out to Andrew Jackson's statue in Jackson Square, and has chiseled into the side of it, the Union must and shall be preserved, as a signal to the people of New Orleans, for you, the war is over. So if you go out there to Jackson Square and you look at the statue, you see that chiseled into the side. That wasn't part of the original monument. That was added on and technically, I guess you could say it was graffiti, official graffiti, but graffiti nonetheless. You accomplished survival at the head of the Stonemason done in Jackson Square. Okay. So that's it. I hope you found it interesting. It wouldn't take long. When you sit down and you look at Antietam and Shiloh, Cold Harbor, Gettysburg, and the amount of carnage. I mean, you're looking at 25,000 men down in 2 or 3 days. When you look at the city, the size of New Orleans, the impact New Orleans had, and the few people that were killed, I think the total was about 170 maybe killed and wounded, is nothing in comparison to what happened when you look at the value of the real estate that was lost. So I want to thank you so much for coming out. If there are any questions, I can attempt to answer them. Yeah.
I live in Slidell, so this is quite a trip. And the first thing I want to do is commend our great presenter and Mr. Sly for their wonderful arrangement of the bombshells bursting in the background. I'm a lawyer and a former retired court administrator, and had the pleasure before Katrina of working with under Mr. Chapman, the history department for a while. And I can't say enough about him. Those of you who know him know him well. But I do take issue with some things. One thing. Although I was born on the south side, I was born in the holy city, Chicago. And that's, of course, called the holy city because every election day here takes place. That lies in both the state Democratic Union. A lot like used to happen down in Louisiana. But this talk is titled "The Fall of New Orleans and the Civil War." To the Yankee that I am, it should read "The Liberation of New Orleans during the Civil War."
Well, we're talking about the great unpleasantness, right?
Pardon me?
We're talking about that great unpleasantness.
Are we really? One thing that amazes me, and that he's brought out so well, is the misreading of what happened in the Civil War, which was so important as a nation. He brings out something most people don't have the damnedest idea about. How quickly New Orleans fell and how essential that was to the Southern economy. that I personally have an opinion in the South is something that has not been. And the great tribute to this great man is that he has led us in the tent. I will now shut up.
Any questions? Well, I really thank you all coming out tonight. As he said, we supplied with bottle sounds. I wish we had a glass roof to see a flashing of lightning, you know, to kind of give us the feeling of the presence, the atmosphere of being there, a little smell of Fortnite, you know, to come through the building.
What we had was enough.
So anyway, I really thank you all for coming out, and we appreciate the support you always give us here at the History Minutes and Lecture Series. Thank you so much.